The morning of my wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect blue sky stretching endlessly above. I should have felt like the happiest woman in the world, but as I slipped into my dress, a whisper of unease rustled through the room like a wayward breeze. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the usual pre-wedding nerves. The church was adorned with flowers, a fragrant aisle laid out before me. Our friends and family turned to watch as I walked toward my future. He stood there, my husband, to be, his usual confident posture slightly wilted. Our eyes met, and instead of warmth, I detected a flicker of something else. Was it reluctance? As the priest began, his voice a soothing baritone, I heard the words I had dreamed of since I was a little girl. But the dream felt tainted as I watched his face contort ever so slightly, as if the vow he was about to make was souring on his tongue. "Do you, Judy, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the priest intoned. "I do," I replied, my voice quivering but strong. It was his turn, and the silence stretched a beat too long. "I do," he finally said, but it sounded like a question hanging in the air, unresolved. After the ceremony, as we sat in the limousine, the confines of the car felt like a cocoon, separating us from the celebrations outside. I reached for his hand, seeking some comfort, some sign that everything was as it should be. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. He looked at me, his eyes a maze I couldn't navigate. "I'm just worried," he muttered, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "Worried about what?" I pressed, needing to understand. "About making you happy, Judy," he said, turning his face away to gaze out of the window. "This is all so new." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they hung between us, a veil of doubt that I couldn't shake off. I wanted to believe him, to chalk it up to the gravity of the day, but a small, insidious thought crept into my mind. Did he really want this? The rest of the ride was spent in silence, a gulf widening with every passing mile. When we arrived at our new home, I stepped across the threshold, my heart heavy with questions. Was this just a beginning, or the start of an ending I couldn't yet see? The early days of our marriage were like living in the afterglow of a long-awaited sunrise. I poured love into every corner of the bungalow, hoping to make it a sanctuary for us both. My marketing job was more demanding than ever, but coming home to him made the long hours worthwhile, or so I believed. He had started a new job at an office downtown, but the fit seemed wrong right from the start. His enthusiasm waned as quickly as the novelty wore off, and soon he was trudging through the door each evening with shoulders hunched and a frown etched deep. "Dinner's almost ready," I'd call out, trying to inject cheer into my voice as the scent of roasted chicken filled the air. "I'm not hungry," he'd reply, a standard refrain that started to echo through the halls, leaving a silence that I couldn't fill. "Why don't you sit down? Tell me about your day," I'd suggest, seeking bridge to his isolated island. "It was just another day, Judy. Same old nonsense, nothing worth mentioning," he'd dismiss, his words dismissive, his eyes avoiding mine. On the weekends, when the house should have been our haven, his mother would arrive, unannounced, her presence an overbearing cloud that stifled the light I tried so hard to maintain. She was like a maestro of manipulation, her criticisms thinly veiled as concern. "Judy, darling, don't you think a wife should be home more often? A man needs his spouse, not an empty house," she would say, her voice dripping with fox sweetness as I prepared tea in the kitchen. "I'm doing the best I can, working to support us," I'd reply, keeping my tone even, my back turned to hide the frustration. "And yet, it seems your best isn't quite enough, is it?" she'd retort, her eyes scanning the room, looking for any imperfection to point out. The conversations with her were like navigating a minefield, every step needing to be calculated, every word measured. But even as I dodged and deflected, I could see the effect it had on him. He seemed to shrink under her scrutiny, his already fragile self-esteem crumbling like dry bread. Despite the growing tension, I continued to save diligently, the safety deposit box my silent vow to a future I still hoped to salvage. It was my hidden act of faith, one that I wasn't ready to share, not even with him, especially not with his mother lurking like a vulture over our lives. As the months rolled on, the house began to feel more like a stage for a play I'd never auditioned for, and less like the home I had envisioned. I realized then that building a home wasn't just about love, it was about the warmth returned, the shared hopes, and the dreams nurtured together. Without them, even the most robust walls could feel paper thin, and the echoes of a marriage not quite whole would reverberate off of them, a haunting melody that I was growing tired of dancing to alone. The change in him was like the slow creep of twilight shadows. subtle at first, then all-encompassing. The man I married, once brimming with aspirations, began to unravel thread by thread. The office job he had secured with such hope became his prison, and eventually he was let go. They called it downsizing, but I could see the relief in his eyes, a man unshackled, yet directionless. At first, the drinks were few, a beer to drown out the sting of failure, a whiskey to warm a bruised ego. But the few turned to many, and the many turned to a constant companion. Bottles clinked in the night, the recycling bin a testament to his newfound occupation. "Dinner's ready," I'd call out as I had taken to preparing meals that often went cold and untouched. "Just a sec," he'd reply, the sound of ice against glass punctuating his words. Hours would pass, and he'd remain in his chair, a solitary figure illuminated by the flickering TV. One night, I found him on the porch, a bottle dangling from his fingers. "You know, this isn't what I wanted," I said softly, sitting beside him, the evening breeze carrying the weight of my words. He turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. "It's not what I wanted either, Judy," he slurred, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite grasp. "But it's all I'm good for now, isn't it?" "That's not true," I protested, reaching out to him, but he pulled away. "It is," he insisted. "I'm a failure, Judy. Can't you see that?" The self-loathing in his voice was a chasm I couldn't cross, no matter how much I wanted to. I watched as he raised the bottle to his lips again, a silent surrender to his inner demons. "Let's get some help," I urged, my heart aching for the man he once was and the man he could still become. "I don't need help. I need to forget," he retorted, standing up abruptly, his silhouette staggering against the starless sky. As the nights grew longer, and the bottles piled up, our home became a mausoleum of the life we were supposed to lead. The laughter and dreams we shared were replaced by the ghostly clink of glass and the sour scent of spirits. I was living with a specter, a shadow of the man I loved, who drowned his sorrows one glass at a time, too lost in the sea of his own despair to see the life buoy I was desperately throwing his way. The foundation of our marriage had begun to resemble the empty bottles that littered our home, hollow and discarded. His drinking had become a relentless tide, each wave crashing harder and leaving more debris in its wake. I kept the house afloat, tirelessly bailing out the water, all while clutching to the hope that we could still navigate to safer shores. Then came the evening that turned the tide irreversibly. It was late. The moon hung like a watchful eye as I returned from another grueling day. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with unsaid words and unspent sighs. "Mark?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no answer, only the creaking of the house settling, as if it too bore the weight of our fractured lives. I found him in our bedroom, sitting on the floor, the safety deposit box pried open beside him, its contents spilled out like secrets in the light. My heart seized, a mix of betrayal and fury knotting in my chest. "What is this, Judy?" he demanded, his words slurred but sharp, holding up a bundle of cash that had been tucked away for our future, a future that was looking bleaker by the second. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. "It's our safety net, Mark." "A child!" he scoffed, tossing the money onto the bed. "Do you really think we're fit to be parents in this mess?" I flinched, the truth in his words a slap. "I was saving it for us, for something better," I tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. "Why didn't you tell me?" he accused, his gaze accusing, as if I were the one who had shattered our vows. "Because I can't trust you anymore, Mark," I shouted, the dam breaking. "Not with this, not with anything. You're drunk more often than not, and I can't. I just can't." He rose unsteadily, the anger in his eyes mirroring my own. "I'm your husband. If you can't trust me, who can you trust?" "I don't know," I whispered, the admission a shard of glass in my heart. That night, the bed we shared was colder than it had ever been, the space between us a chasm filled with broken trust and shattered dreams. The safety deposit box, a symbol of hope, now lay bare, a mocking reminder of a future that might never be. And as I listened to the rhythm of his breath, deep and even in sleep, I wondered if the man I married was just another dream I had to wake up from. The dawn broke with a merciless brightness that morning, filtering through the curtains and casting a judgmental glow over the remnants of last night's tempest. The bed was cold beside me, the imprint of his body a stark reminder of the rift that had widened into a gaping maw. I stretched my hand across the sheets, the fabric cool and unwelcoming. The emptiness of the house resonated within me, a hollow echo that seemed to mock the emptiness in my chest. My feet found the floor, and I padded through the silence to the kitchen, the heart of our home now devoid of its pulse. That's when I saw it. The space where the safety deposit box had been was glaringly bare, a clean square in the dust where it had rested, undisturbed until last night. A coldness spread through me, colder than the stone tiles beneath my feet. And there, amidst the chaos of my thoughts, lay the divorce papers. They were neatly folded, the crispness of the edges in stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within me. His handwriting adorned the top sheet, a message that was at once a goodbye and a final insult. "Judy," I read aloud, my voice a stranger to my ears. "I can't live like this anymore. I won't." The room spun as I grasped the edge of the table for support. This was his answer, then. A flight in the night, a theft, a severing of our bonds with the cold efficiency of a blade. I picked up the papers, the texture of the paper, grainy beneath my fingertips. I unfolded them, laying them out before me like a map of a land I no longer recognized. Why? The question escaped my lips. A single word that held the weight of 1,000 moments, a million shards of a life I thought we were building. "You're better off without me." His voice, a phantom whisper from the past, played in my mind. It was something he had said before, in one of his rare moments of drunken clarity. I took a deep breath, the air sharp in my lungs. "No," I replied to the ghost of him. "We were supposed to be better together." The pen was heavy in my hand. A weapon and a key all at once. With every stroke of my name on papers, I felt a piece of the pain lift, an unraveling of the knot that had been tightening around my heart. The divorce was not a question of if, but of when. The when had arrived with the sunrise, with the stark absence of the man I had vowed to stand beside in sickness and in health. Sickness had come, and health had fled, and I was left standing alone. The police. I needed to call the police. The betrayal was not just emotional, but now criminal. I reached for the phone, the numbers a litany of finality, the end of an act in the tragic play of our marriage. The call was brief, my report succinct. "My husband has stolen from me," I said, my voice steady, belying the quake that threatened to consume me. "And I believe I know where he might be." The pieces were in motion, a cascade that would end in the stark light of justice. I clutched the divorce papers, a talisman against the uncertainty of the future. Today, I would confront the end of us. Today, I would reclaim the remnants of me. With the divorce papers clutched in my trembling hand, I stood outside the familiar facade of his mother's house. It was a structure I had come to associate with discomfort and disdain, but today, it was the backdrop of my final stand. The police arrived in a whisper of sirens and a hush of authority. I led the way, my resolve a fragile shell around the chaos of my emotions. The door yielded to my knock, his mother answering with a facade of innocence that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Judy, what is this? Why are the police here?" she asked, her voice a symphony of feigned surprise. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. "In the den," she said, gesturing with a shaky hand, the veneer of control slipping. The den was a room steeped in shadows, but today it was illuminated by the stark truth. There he was, the man I once loved, his figure hunched over the open safe. Our safe, its contents spread before him like the spoils of war. "Mark," I said, my voice a blade, "what have you done?" He looked up, his face a mask of guilt that he couldn't hide. "Judy," he began, but his words were cut short by the officers stepping forward. "You need to come with us, sir," one of the officers said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark's gaze shifted to me, searching for an ally where there was none to be found. "Judy, please," he pleaded. "I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," I replied, the finality in my voice echoing in the suddenly cramped room. His mother, ever the matriarch, stepped forward, her hand reaching out as if to shield her son. "You can't do this! He's my son!" she cried, her voice cracking under the strain. "He's also a thief," I said, turning to face her, "and you, his accomplice." The room was thick with tension, the officers a silent audience to our domestic tragedy. I watched as they rid him his rights, the click of the handcuffs a punctuation mark at the end of our shared story. As he was led away, I held out the divorce papers, the document that severed what little was left of our bond. "Consider these my last gift to you," I said, the words a hollow victory. His mother was weeping now, her sobs a soundtrack to the dismantling of their facade. She looked at me, her eyes searching for mercy. "Judy, Save it!" I cut her off, the bitterness in my voice a testament to the years of her poison. "You've done enough." The officers turned to her, their expressions grim. "Ma'am, we're going to need to ask you some questions," one of them said, signaling the beginning of her own reckoning. I stood there, amidst the ruins of what was once a marriage, a life. The papers in my hand felt lighter now, as if in signing them, I'd also signed away the weight they carried. I had come for a confrontation, but I left with a declaration of my own independence, of the beginning of a life that was once again my own. The courtroom was a world away from the warm, love-filled scenes I had once imagined my marriage would be full of. Instead of shared glances of affection, there were cold, hard stares. Where there should have been supportive whispers, there was a sterile sound of legal proceedings. I sat there, a solitary figure amidst a sea of faces, some sympathetic, most indifferent. The judge presided over the room with an air of detached finality, his gavel poised like the sword of Damocles over the fate of the two people who had wronged me most deeply. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began, directing his gaze at my soon-to-be ex-husband. "Mark Thompson," he replied, his voice betraying a tremor of nervousness. "And can you tell us what happened on the night of September 15th? The prosecutor pressed on. Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering to me before returning to the safety of his lap. I took a safety deposit box that belonged to my wife." "And was this act premeditated?" The question was a spear, aimed to impale any remnants of his defense. "No," Mark stammered. "It wasn't like that. I was desperate. You were aware, however, that taking the box was against the law." "Yeah," Mark conceded, his head hanging low. "I knew." The prosecutor turned his attention to the other defendant. "Mrs. Thompson," he addressed Mark's mother with a clinical politeness. "How do you plead to the charge of accessory to theft?" The woman who had tormented me with her presence, who had stood tall and proud in her son's defense, now seemed small and deflated. "Guilty," she whispered, and it was the sweetest word I had heard her say. The judge cleared his throat, a sound that called the room to order. "In light of the evidence presented and the defendant's pleas, I am ready to pass sentence." I held my breath, the air in the courtroom thick with anticipation. "Mark Thompson, for the crime of theft, I sentence you to 6 years in prison," the judge declared, his voice unyielding. There was a gasp from behind me, but I remained still, my eyes fixed on the man I had once loved. "And to you, Mrs. Thompson, I impose a fine of $700,000 for your role as an accessory to this crime," he continued, and I could almost hear the shackles of her arrogance breaking. The gavel fell, and with it, the curtain on this charade of justice. But this wasn't just about retribution. It was about reclaiming my life. "Judy!" Mark called out as the bailiff led him away. "I'm sorry." I turned to look at him, my gaze steady. "Your apologies can't undo the past, Mark. I hope you find some peace in the future." As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter, the sky a deeper shade of freedom. The weight that had been pressing on my shoulders was gone, replaced by a sense of liberation. I had come seeking justice, and I had found it, not just in the sentence passed down by the judge, but in the knowledge that I could close this chapter of my life. It was a vindication that was both bitter and sweet. A chapter ended so that a new one could begin. In the end, I had stood up for myself, against those who sought to bring me down. My heart might have been bruised, but it was still beating, strong and ready for whatever came next. This was not the story I'd written for myself, but it was one I could now rewrite, on my own terms. And that was the most just outcome of all.